We are in a series called Fame. We're looking at the Bible's Hall of Fame chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. It's a passage that reminds us and brings back into our sight some of the heroes of the faith throughout the history of humanity. And so far, I think kind of the overarching tagline that I would give to this series is that faith is measured by your feet, not by your feelings. And one of the things you see in every single one of these characters' lives is they put their faith into action in various ways, through various circumstances. We're going to see that again tonight in this man named Moses. But faith is measured, it's measured ultimately by what you do, not by what you say you're going to do. And we've all seen that in our lives personally, but we've seen it in others' lives. Those who have all the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And these are people in Hebrews chapter 11. Of course, they're not perfect, and we've seen that every single week. They're far from perfection, but they do walk by faith, and they put feet to their faith. And so as we've looked at each of these exhibits, we've seen examples of that. And as we enter the hall tonight, what we see is images of reeds. It kind of looks as if we're beginning to walk towards a river. We hear the sound of rushing water. We look down the hall on the wall, and peeking through those tall, wild reeds is a young girl's face. And she's looking into the river, where there's a basket floating on the water. And inside the basket sleeps God's people's hope for freedom. You and I, we know this man as Moses. In our minds, when I say the name Moses, my mind, your mind, probably goes immediately to the great Exodus. Moses leading the people out of Israel, the plagues, the Red Sea. I mean, all of these incredible stories, maybe the burning bush, all of these incredible stories. But the story starts long before that. And the author of Hebrews gives us a glimpse to that. As we look tonight at this faith in action, what faith produces in Moses' life, I want to kind of remind you of the definition we saw several weeks ago back in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. It says this, Hebrews chapter 11, 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So tonight, each of the acts, so to speak, or the scenes we're going to see in Moses' life, each of them is produced by faith. That is, according to our definition, the assurance of something hoped for, namely God's promise to be all that the believer needs. So I want you to watch for that as we look at this in Hebrews chapter 11 tonight. Watch for the way that hope in God produces a new kind of behavior. And I want you to notice as well that each of these acts of faith, they cover a period of 80 years from Moses' birth to the time he leads God's people out of Egypt. And I want you to notice that in these moments of Moses' life, the stress is tremendous. I think sometimes, I don't know about you, but like my D group, we have our Bible reading, and sometimes I just get so focused in accomplishing my task that I read and I don't really stop and think deeply about the text. But I want us to do that tonight. I want you to stop and notice the stress that would exist. It's easy to see these Bible characters and just kind of not put them in real life and not really stop and think about, man, if I were in this situation, think about all the emotions and the stress that would come with that, because I think you'll see that. Each of these instances that we're going to see in Moses' life, each of them is a life and death situation. I mean, they're being faced with life and death. If we were in their shoes, I mean, we would be knotted up inside, barely able to go to sleep at night. And that's kind of the context of what's happening in their lives. So we're going to see what faith produces in the midst of these kinds of stressful situations. So Hebrews 11, some different spots here in the text, verse 23, 24, and 27, we're going to look at specifically. I'm going to call these three crises of faith in Moses' life. So tonight, the title of this message is Moses' Faith in Crisis. We're going to see his faith fleshed out in these moments of high intensity, high stress. You could call them crisis in his life. So verse 23, let's look at the first one, chapter 11. Read along with me. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That's the first one. The second one, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Verse 27, this is the third one. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. 3 crisis points in Moses' life. And I think the point of all of these verses is that faith, the assurance of things hoped for, makes all the difference at those points in our lives. I think what he's saying here is that our faith, which is an assurance of the things that we hope for in the future, the promises of God that would come, that's actually what helps us to walk through these moments of crisis. That's exactly what happened in Moses' life. So number one, the first crisis, if you're taking notes, the first crisis we find here in verse 23, and I want you to notice a phrase, because it's going to be repeated again in a moment, but it says, they were not afraid of the king's edict. It's interesting to me, this first crisis, right? This first mention of Moses in the Hall of Fame begins really before he was even born. And it's really a testimony of whose faith? His parents, right? It's his family, specifically his parents. And it's a great reminder, I think, for those of us in the room tonight who are moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas. Our faith absolutely does have an impact on our family and future generations. Moses' story, included here in the great Hall of Fame passage in Hebrews 11, actually begins with the faith of his family, specifically the faith of his mom and dad. So this first crisis is really not about Moses at all. I mean, he makes no choice to be born. He makes no choice for his parents to disregard the edict of the king. And yet he benefits from the faith of his family, from the faith of his parents. It's a great reminder for us that our decisions, what we choose to do regarding our faith, has an impact for far beyond what we can even see. So this first crisis has to do with the faith of Moses' parents when he was born. And if you remember the story, we're not going to flip back there. You can do this on your own time if you'd like. But that story, it's in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. You remember it, the king of Egypt, the people of God, the people of Israel, they're in slavery in Egypt, but their population is growing tremendously. Apparently, they were really following the be fruitful and multiply. But the king gets afraid, right? Because as this nation that's in slavery begins to grow within his kingdom, he's fearful that they're going to overthrow Egypt. And so he issues an edict that all of the Jewish males must be killed at birth. Exodus 1:22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every Jewish son who is born to you, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you're to keep alive. So the edict that the author of Hebrews is talking about here, that the parents of Moses disregarded, was this edict to have their sons killed. Now I want you to notice, though, there are really 2 threats. There are 2 threats in this edict from the king. One is explicit, that Jewish baby boys are to be killed. All Jewish baby boys are to be killed. The other threat is implicit. If you disobey this command and keep a Jewish baby boy alive, you'll be disobedient to the king's law and you'll risk your own life. In other words, parents really had 2 choices in this day. 2 choices. They could kill themselves, and they could kill their sons and save themselves, or they could try to save their sons and risk their own lives. There was no middle path, right? It was one of 2 options. And I think that's important to see because Hebrews 11:23 really doesn't make sense if you don't understand that those were the two options that they had. Because it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and it says they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, initially you read that and you say, well, of course they were afraid of the king's edict, right? I mean, of course they were afraid. Otherwise, they would have never placed baby Moses in a basket and put him in the river, right? I mean, if they weren't afraid of the king's edict that they were to kill all of their male babies, then what would they have done? Well, they would have just had their baby boy and kept him in their home like normal and showed him off to the neighbors. I mean, if they weren't afraid of the king's command that the baby boys would be killed or should be killed, then why would they ever hide him in the first place? So what does verse 23 mean? Well, it says that they hid their son because they were not afraid of the king's edict. What you would expect is that it would say they hid their son because they were afraid, not because they weren't afraid. And of course, surely that's right. I mean, if they had not been afraid for their son's life, they would have just gone on as normal, carried around their son in public. And the answer is there's two edicts. There's two threats in his edict, not just one. One, yes, was against the babies, and one was against those who did not kill the babies. So if you kill the baby, you save your life. If you don't kill your baby, you risk your life. So when Moses' parents decided that they are not going to drown their son in the Nile River, but instead they're going to hide him, here's what they're doing. They're risking their own lives. In other words, they look the fear of death and perhaps torture in the face, and they say, we're not giving in. We're not giving in. We will not give in to you. We will not kill our son out of fear for our own lives. Fear of death will not control us. And I think that's the point of this text. This act of courage against the king and this act of love towards their son, well, what does it come from? It comes from faith. By faith. Moses was hidden by his parents because they weren't afraid of the king's edict that if they saved him, he would kill them. Now, how does faith produce that kind of courage? Well, again, I think the definition from chapter 11, verse 1 gives us the answer. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Faith frees us for this kind of radical courage and risk-taking because it's the assurance that what God promises to those who die in the path of faith is better than what the world promises those who shun risk and save themselves. It basically says that death walking in faith is better than a life of fear, rejecting what God has said. So more simply, it could be said this way. Faith in God's promises frees us from the fear of death and makes us brave in the life of faith. And that's what you see in Moses' parents. But there's a kind of a minor point I want to bring out here as well. It's important for all of us who want our lives to be on the cutting edge, where there are risks and dangers and great crisis and great needs. It's this important balance of reality and balance. I want you to notice this. Moses' parents, they risked their lives not by killing their baby, but they did hide the baby. Now, we've all experienced this and probably even had people who've said these kinds of things to us. Some people's minds, which I would say immature minds, with little real life experience and out of touch with the complexity of living in a fallen world, they might say, well, if Moses' parents, if they really had faith, I mean, if they really, really had true faith, they wouldn't hide their baby. I mean, if they really trusted God, why would they go through this elaborate scheme to hide the baby in a basket and put him on the river and then send their daughter to watch? And then when Pharaoh's daughter got him, she would say, hey, I know someone who can. Why would they go through this whole process? Why wouldn't they just trust God Why wouldn't they just trust God? Well, that I don't think is balancing reality and faith. I don't think it is. My mind immediately goes to the great hero more modern in our day, Corrie ten Boom, who grew up and lived through concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and she hid Jews and Christians in her home and was a woman of incredible faith. If you've never read her biography, you need to do that because it's such a powerful testimony. But you could say the same thing. Well, if Corrie ten Boom really had faith, why would she have hid those Jews? Well, because faith and reality in a fallen world, it doesn't mean that we are stupid, right? It doesn't mean that Moses' parents, if they would have really had faith, they would have just strolled around public with their baby boy, right? That's a point that I want to make sure that you see. Well, how do you respond to somebody like that? Because I've heard them. I don't know, maybe you haven't heard people like that. I've heard people like that. People who say, oh, you don't trust God. You're using human ingenuity to protect this baby instead of entrusting the baby to God. Perhaps the best way to respond to them is just tell them to read their Bible and to read it carefully, right? Because you see an example of this right here, and they're commended in Hebrews chapter 11 for their faith. The Bible says Moses' parents had faith and they hid their baby. Not killing the baby put their life at risk and was a great act of faith. Hiding their baby was an act of human, but I believe God-given wisdom, and no less from faith. To do otherwise, I think, would have been presumption. It's like the idea of when Satan tempted Jesus, right? He's on top of the temple and he says, throw yourself, jump off the temple and see if God would catch you. Well, of course, Jesus had all faith. He had perfect faith. And yet that would be an act of presumption, testing God. It wouldn't be wisdom. So how do we apply this today? Well, one way could be to say that following God's call to work with sick patients in third world countries is an act of risk-taking faith. And wearing gloves and a mask during treatment is an act of faithful wisdom. Right? Following God's call to live in a rough neighborhood because God's called you to reach that area. It's an act of risk-taking faith. But buying deadbolts for your door is an act of faithful wisdom, right? Following God's call to Guinea or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan with your children, your family, that's an act of risk-taking faith. But giving your children vaccinations and malaria treatments is an act of faithful wisdom. Those two things, they absolutely go hand in hand. God doesn't call us to throw out all reason and wisdom. That's not what it means to walk by faith. Living by faith is often perplexing to the world. The world would say, why in the world would you risk your life to go and to be at a place where you could contract some disease that we've eradicated from our first world country? Or why would you risk your family's life by going to a neighborhood that's a little rougher or a little more crime or poverty? Why would you do that? Yes, it doesn't make sense to the world, but it doesn't mean that we throw out all reason and wisdom. This is why I think Paul in Colossians chapter 1 prays that those that he has led to the Lord would have spiritual wisdom and bear fruit in every good work. It's risky, it's inconvenient, it may be dangerous, it may be inopportune, but we should still walk in wisdom. This is why Paul prays for this spiritual wisdom. So that's crisis number one, all right? I'm going to skip to number 3 because I think number 2 kind of helps answer number 3. So I want you to jump to verse 27. Verse 27, Hebrews chapter 11. I read this already, but this is really the third crisis. I'm doing them out of order, and that's okay. Those of you who like the order, it's all right. You'll see why. 27, by faith, Moses, he leaves Egypt. He left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. I do the first and the third because this is 40 years later, but the situation that Moses is faced with is very similar. It's a lot like the situation that his parents faced at his birth. And I think we'll understand it better connecting the two. So, according to Exodus chapter 2, Moses begins to identify himself. So, we know the story, right? Moses, his parents put him in the basket, float him down the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses in this basket. She decides she wants to keep him for himself. She needs someone who can nurse the child. Moses' sister has been watching. She says, I know someone who can nurse him. So basically what ends up happening is Moses grows up in his family's home. His mother nurses him, cares for him, trains him, teaches him. But he's he's a son of the daughter of Pharaoh. So he's also a prince of the palace. And this is his life. But the scripture tells us that he identifies himself not with Egypt, but rather with his Jewish people. And in chapter 2 of Exodus, we find out that he's actually angered because of their slavery, because of the harsh treatment that is happening to his people. So he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, and he intervenes in this situation, and he kills the Egyptian. And he thought that this had been done in secret. But the next day, he discovers that word has gotten around. And Exodus 2:14 says that then Moses was afraid and said, surely the matter has become known. The next verse says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled the presence of Pharaoh, and he settles in the land of Midian. So 40 years later from his birth, he's 40 years old at this point, this scene happens. Now, here's a problem like the one we saw in verse 23. Because in verse 27, it says, Moses, by faith, leaves Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. Now, it presents another problem, right? Well, if he's not afraid, why does he leave, right? In Exodus, when you go back and read the story, it actually says that Moses was afraid, and that's why he leaves, because Pharaoh's trying to kill him. So it's a similar problem. So is he afraid? Is he not afraid? Was his parents afraid? Were they not afraid? Well, in verse 23, it says that his parents hid their baby because they were not afraid of the king's edict. Here it says, Moses leaves Egypt not fearing the wrath of the king. But we see that his parents were at least afraid enough to hide their baby, and we see in Exodus that Moses was afraid. So you see the similarity, right, between these two. There's a connection here. So did Moses leave out of fear, or didn't he? I'm getting some no's, I'm getting some yeses, okay? Well, it's like asking the same question. Did his parents hide Moses from Pharaoh out of fear, or didn't they? Well, really the answer is yes and no, right? The answer for his parents is that they did fear for their child's life. They did fear for Moses' life. But they didn't act out of fear for themselves. So they risked their lives, and they did it by faith in future hope. What's a little bit different with Moses, but also somewhat similar. He probably did save his life by leaving Egypt. But was fearful self-preservation Moses' motive for leaving? I mean, that's the question. When verse 27 says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, did the writer and author of Hebrews forget about Exodus 2:14? Did he forget that? Or is he pointing out to us something very crucial and very deep in Moses' heart so that we won't misunderstand what happened in Exodus 2? I think the key to that is found here in verse 27, where it says, endured. Endured. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured. Some of your translations might use a different word. They might say persevered. I don't know if anybody has a different translation in here. Say persevered. So there's this idea of, well, why did Moses leave? Why did he leave? Well, he did it because he was enduring. He was persevering. In other words, it wasn't fear that caused Moses to lead. It was endurance. Well, what does that mean? Endurance in what? Well, endurance implies this this chosen path of difficulty that you're tempted to forsake, but you hang in there. You endure. I think what the author of Hebrews is referring to when he says that Moses left Egypt for he endured is this idea of what path had Moses chosen that required endurance to stay on. What path is it that he's chosen that led him to leave Egypt for 40 years before he comes back to rescue God's people? Well, I think that's answered by the second crisis that he faced in verse 24 through 26. So let's jump back to it. Verse 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I think that's the answer. These verses describe to us a radically dangerous and costly path that Moses had chosen before, right? Before he felt threatened by Pharaoh. This took place before. What was the path that he chose? By faith, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing. I think you should underline that word. It wasn't like this situation arose with the Egyptian treating the slave, the Jewish slave, harshly, and then Moses intervenes and he kills him, and now it's like, I have no choice. Pharaoh wants me dead because I've killed him. No, before that ever happened, Moses chose. He chose to what? To endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Now, let me stop there for just a second because this is kind of a side note as well, but this reminds us a little bit about sin. I love how the scripture is just brutally honest with us because he says what? Pleasures of sin. Pleasures of sin. Is sin sometimes pleasurable, enjoyable, fun? If you say no, then you're lying, right? If sin was as terrible as taking a spoonful of nasty grape-flavored cough medicine, I mean, none of us would do it, right? We wouldn't do it. The reason that sin is so addictive, the reason that it's so enticing is because it oftentimes feels good. The Bible doesn't try to hide that reality from us. This passage reminds us that yes, sin can be fun, but at its best, it's what's described here, a passing pleasure. That's why a person has to keep on sinning to experience sin's highest level of enjoyment. Sin requires an even greater level of sin to provide the same pleasure. You have to up the dosage to get the same impact. That's why sin often turns into addiction, right? Because you have to go further and further and further to get the same feeling again and again and again. And the Bible tells us all this. It doesn't hide this from us. There is some enjoyment and some pleasure, but it is a passing pleasure. Then notice what it says about Moses. So he chooses rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, the passing pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ. Considering, it means to count the cost. Moses counted the cost. There was careful consideration. He thought through this decision carefully. And he decided what? It says that the reproach of Christ was greater riches than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking to the reward. What is faith? What is faith? It's a hope. It's an assurance of hope, that which is unseen. Moses is looking forward. He's not looking at the here and the now and the passing pleasures of this life. He's not looking at the here and now, the treasures of Egypt. He's looking forward to what is unseen, to this greater reward that is coming. The writer of Hebrews expresses the dangerous, painful path that Moses had chosen in two ways. First, it says he chooses the ill treatment with the people of God over the passing pleasures of sin. Second, in verse 26, it says he chooses the reproach of Christ, the Messiah, over the treasures of Egypt. Now, I don't want you to miss this tonight. The choice was made before the threat of Pharaoh. The choice was made. The bridges had already been burned between Moses and Egypt. It had already happened in his heart, right? Not yet geographically. He hadn't left Egypt physically yet, but spiritually and morally, he was already gone. Do you see that? This has already taken place in his heart. The question was, would he endure in his chosen path of suffering for the people of God and the glory of Christ, or would he cave in? Would he give in? Like so many cave in today to the Egypts of this world, the passing pleasures of this world. Would he follow through and endure when it actually push came to shove, right? It's like he had made the choice, and now it was a testing of whether he was actually going to follow through with it. Are you going to be identified with the people of God and face the ill treatment and bear the reproach of Christ, or are you going to cave in? Are you going to cave in to Egypt? Was Moses' flight from Egypt a departure to a self-serving, fearful pursuit of ease and comfort and safety? I think verse 27 tells us, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. Fear was not his basic mindset. What was his mindset? It's that word endured, for he endured. In what? In the same deep motivation that caused him to choose ill treatment with the people of God and reproach for the sake of Christ. That's why he endured, as seeing him who is unseen. In other words, by faith, by looking to God's promise, not Pharaoh's threat. That's what caused him to leave and to endure. This is the same motive that drove his choices in verses 24 through 26. And you see it at the end of verse 26. He chose ill treatment with God's people. He chose reproach for Christ because he was looking forward to the reward. Looking to the reward. In verse 26, it says, he's seeing him, God, who is unseen. He had faith. He had by faith burned the bridges in his mind, and then by faith he burned them in his flight by leaving Egypt. I mean, sure, he experienced the emotion of fear. I think certainly he experienced it. That's what Exodus tells us. I think his parents experienced the emotion of fear, but that wasn't what motivated him. That's not what drove him. Sure, they hid their baby, and that was somewhat motivated by fear for the king Pharaoh killing them, but it wasn't a self-serving unbelief. And Moses' leaving Egypt was not a self-serving unbelief. It was a persevering, an enduring, in spite of fear, an obedience of faith. He wasn't driven merely or mainly by fear. He looked to the unseen God to work out his purposes for his people. And by the way, 40 years later, he would discover exactly what that purpose was. He comes back to Egypt, and God uses Moses to free his people. I don't believe that Moses had all of that revealed to him in a vision. I think he knew that God was up to something with him. I think probably his parents had communicated to him in those early years as they brought him up that God obviously had a plan for him. It spared his life. So I certainly think he had this hope in this promise, but I don't believe that God had revealed exactly how he was going to use Moses at this point in time. But the bridges were burned between Moses and Egypt well before he was threatened. They were burned in his heart. They were burned by faith. And I think that's what faith does all throughout this chapter. Faith is a hunger for God that triumphs over our hunger for the pleasures of this world. And what it leads us to do is to walk out in obedience, trusting that what God has for us is better. So faith unleashes this radically God-centered, risk-taking, people-loving behavior in our lives. And that's what we see in all of these characters. So my challenge for us tonight is this. Let's be Moses. Let's be Moses. Let's look to the reward of God's promises. As it says in verse 26, let's look to the God who is unseen, as it says in verse 27. Let's be so hungry for the superior worth of our God, that the bridges are burned to 100 sins and 100 fears. That God is so worth it to us, that what he promises and that greater reward that is coming one day from walking in him, that would be in our sight, just like Moses, so that we could burn the bridges that connect us to all of these other trivial things that, might bring some pleasure for a moment, but in the end, they don't last.